The air inside the courtroom felt heavy, like it was full of water, making it hard to breathe. It was a Tuesday morning. But for the 16-year-old boy sitting in the wooden chair at the front of the room, it felt like the end of the world. The room was big and cold, with high ceilings that made the smallest sound echo. The floor was polished wood that shone under the bright lights, and the walls were a dull, serious gray. At the front, high above everyone else, sat the judge. She looked like she was carved out of stone, staring down at the people below through glasses that sat low on her nose. The boy, let's call him Leo, sat very still. He kept his hands folded in his lap, squeezing his fingers together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was wearing a white button-up shirt that was a little too stiff and a tie that felt like it was choking him. His shoes were new and pinched his toes, reminding him with every step that he didn't belong here. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a kid who liked basketball and fixing up old bicycles in his garage. But looking around the room, nobody seemed to see that. To them, he was just another case number on a docket. Sitting next to him was his lawyer, a woman named Ms. Gable. She looked tired. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she had stacks of paper spread out in front of her. She was scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad, her pen moving fast and scratching loudly against the paper. Every few seconds she would stop and sigh, rubbing her temples like she had a headache. Leo looked at her with big, worried eyes. He wanted to ask her if everything was going to be okay, but he didn't dare speak. He knew how serious this was. On the other side of the room sat the prosecutor. This man looked confident. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Leo's parents made in a month. He was leaning back in his chair, talking in a low voice to his assistant. He looked relaxed, like he was just waiting for a bus to arrive. But every time he looked over at Leo, his eyes were cold. He didn't see a teenager. He saw a problem that needed to be removed. It made Leo's stomach hurt to look at him. Behind a low wooden wall, the jury sat watching. 12 strangers who held Leo's future in their hands. They looked bored, some of them shifting in their seats, others looking at the clock. Leo wondered what they were thinking. Did they already decide he was guilty? The prosecutor had spent the last hour talking about justice and safety. He used big words and painted a picture of a neighborhood that was afraid. He talked about a robbery that happened at a corner store late at night. He told the jury that the police had found someone nearby who matched the description. That someone was Leo. Leo remembered that night clearly. He remembered walking home from his friend's house because his bike had a flat tire. He remembered the police car pulling up next to him, the flashing blue and red lights lighting up the dark street. He remembered the handcuffs snapping onto his wrists, cold and heavy. He tried to tell them then that he hadn't done anything, but they didn't want to listen. Now, sitting in this quiet room, the fear of that moment came rushing back. He felt a lump forming in his throat, but he swallowed it hard. He promised his mother he wouldn't cry. He looked out into the audience. His mother was sitting in the second row. She was holding a crumpled tissue in her hand, and her eyes were red and puffy. She looked small and fragile in the large courtroom. When Leo caught her eye, she tried to smile, but it looked more like a grimace. She was terrified. His father wasn't there. He couldn't get time off work, which made Leo feel even more lonely. He was on an island, surrounded by people who wanted to punish him. The judge shifted in her chair, the leather creaking loudly. Everyone went silent. She looked down at the prosecutor and nodded, giving him the signal to continue. The prosecutor stood up, buttoning his jacket. He walked to the center of the room, turning his back on the judge to face the jury. He planted his feet and spoke with a voice that was smooth and strong. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor began, pacing slowly. "We aren't just talking about stolen money here. We are talking about a violation of trust. We are talking about a community that can't even go to the store for milk without looking over their shoulder." He paused for effect, letting the silence hang in the air. "The evidence is clear. The defendant was found just blocks away. He fit the description. He had no good explanation for why he was out so late." Leo felt his face get hot. He had an explanation. He had told the police. He told the lawyer. He told anyone who would listen. But the prosecutor made it sound like being out late was a crime itself. He made Leo sound like a shadow lurking in the alley, waiting to hurt someone. It wasn't fair. Leo wanted to stand up and shout, "I was just walking home. I live there." But Ms. Gable put a hand on his arm, stopping him. She shook her head, almost invisible. She knew the rules. She knew that now was not the time. The prosecutor continued, "This isn't a mistake. This is a pattern. We need to send a message that this behavior will not be tolerated." He made Leo sound like a monster, but Leo knew the truth. He knew he was the kid who helped his neighbor carry groceries. He was the kid who volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. He was the kid who got straight A's in math. But none of that was in this room. In this room, he was just a defendant. The judge looked at her watch. It was almost time for a break. The tension in the room was thick, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Each second felt like it was scraping away at Leo's life. Ms. Gable leaned over and whispered to Leo, "It's going to get harder before it gets easier. They are going to bring up your past record." "My past record?" Leo whispered back, his voice cracking. "You mean the time I skipped school?" "Anything they can use to make you look bad," she said quietly. "Just keep your head down. Don't react." Leo nodded, but inside he felt like he was spinning out of control. He had skipped school once to go to the beach. That was his record. Now that one mistake was being used to make him look like a career criminal. It felt like the whole system was a machine designed to crush him, and nobody knew how to stop it. The judge announced a 15-minute recess. The sound of the gavel hitting the wood block was like a gunshot. The jury stood up and shuffled out of the room. The prosecutor packed his bag and walked out, chatting on his phone. The courtroom began to empty, the heavy wooden door groaning as people left. Leo stayed seated. He didn't want to move. He felt like if he moved, gravity would take him and he would fall through the floor. Ms. Gable stood up and stretched. "I'm going to grab a coffee," she said. "Stay here. Don't talk to anyone." Leo was left alone at the table for a moment. He looked at the empty jury box. He looked at the judge's empty chair. He looked at the flag standing in the corner of the room. He felt very small. He thought about his bedroom at home. He thought about his messy desk and his poster of his favorite basketball player. He wanted to be there so badly. He wanted to wake up and realize this was all a bad dream, but the smell of the floor wax and the cold air on his arms told him it was real. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing thoughts in his head. He knew he was innocent. He knew he hadn't robbed that store. But knowing the truth and proving the truth felt like they were oceans apart. He looked over at his mother, who was wiping her eyes. He had to be strong for her. He couldn't let them break him. As he sat there, waiting for the courtroom to fill back up, a strange feeling started to grow in his chest. It was small at first, like a spark. It was a feeling of unfairness. It wasn't just anger. It was a determination. He realized that staying quiet and letting the adults handle it might not be enough. The lawyer was tired, the judge was strict, and the prosecutor was ruthless. Leo felt like he was the only one in the room who actually knew what happened that night. He was the only one who lived his life. He put his hand in his pocket and felt the crumpled piece of paper he had put there earlier that morning. It was just a homework assignment, but for some reason he hadn't taken it out when he changed into his court clothes. He fingered the edges of the paper, feeling the texture. The bailiff shouted, "All rise," as the judge walked back in. The room filled up again with people and noise. The spell was broken, and the trial was about to continue. But that spark in Leo's chest was still there, glowing quietly in the dark. The heavy wooden door creaked open again, and the seriousness of the situation rushed back in like a cold wind. The judge took her seat, smoothing her black robe before looking over the rim of her glasses. The bailiff called out for order, and the courtroom settled back into that deep, uncomfortable silence. Leo straightened his tie, which felt like a noose around his neck, and tried to look confident. He looked at Ms. Gable, hoping for a reassuring nod, but she was busy organizing a chaotic stack of papers. Her face looked pale, and Leo noticed a small tremor in her hand as she reached for her pen. That scared him more than anything else. If the person who was supposed to save him was nervous, what hope did he have? The prosecutor stood up again, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. He looked like a man who had already won a prize and was just waiting for them to hand it to him. He walked toward the judge's bench with a confident stride. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, his voice smooth and oily. "The state calls its next witness. Mr. Albert Higgins." A side door opened, and an older man walked in. He looked frail and tired. He was wearing a store uniform that was a little too big for him, hanging loosely on his shoulders. His white hair was thin, and he walked slowly with a slight limp, leaning on a cane. This was the clerk from the store, the man who had been working the night the robbery happened. Leo watched him closely. He looked like someone's grandfather, the kind of man who gave out hard candy on Halloween. Seeing him made Leo's stomach drop. It was one thing to argue about laws and evidence, but it was another thing to see a scared old man pointing a finger at you. Mr. Higgins took the stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. He sat down heavily, sighing as he adjusted his glasses. The prosecutor approached him, speaking softly, almost kindly. "Mr. Higgins," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court what happened on the night of November 14th? The old man leaned into the microphone. "It was a Tuesday," he said, his voice raspy. "It was raining. Not heavy, just a drizzle. The store was empty. I was restocking the cigarettes behind the counter. Then what happened?" The prosecutor asked gently. Then the door chime rang. A boy came in. He had a hoodie up, covering his hair. He walked to the counter, but he didn't look at the candy. He kept his head down. He had his hand in his pocket like he was holding something. Leo gripped the edge of the table. He remembered walking into stores with his hood up when it was raining. He did that all the time. "Did you see his face?" The prosecutor asked. Mr. Higgins hesitated. "Not at first." He mumbled something. "I couldn't hear him. I asked him to speak up." That's when he looked up. The light from the refrigerator units hit his face. He looked young, scared. Then he grabbed the cash register drawer and ran. The prosecutor walked over to the defense table, gesturing toward Leo. "Mr. Higgins, do you see that person in this courtroom today who robbed you?" Mr. Higgins squinted his eyes, looking directly at Leo. He stared at him for a long, uncomfortable minute. Leo held his breath, wishing the man would look past him, wishing he would say no. "It's him," the old man said firmly, pointing a shaking finger at Leo. "That's the boy. I remember the eyes." He looked scared then, just like he looks now. Murmur went through the courtroom. The judge banged her gavel, but the damage was done. The jury looked at Leo with suspicion and fear. To them, an innocent man doesn't get pointed out by a trembling old man. Leo felt a hot flush of shame rise up his neck. He wanted to scream, "I wasn't there. I was at school." But he sat frozen, feeling like a trapped animal. Miss Gable stood up. It was her turn to ask questions, her chance to fix this. She walked to the center of the room, but she didn't look as confident as the prosecutor. She looked hurried. "Mr. Higgins," she said, "you testified that it was raining and dark outside. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am. Drizzle." "And the suspect was wearing a hoodie?" "Yes." "And the store was empty, so you were in the back?" "Mostly, until he came to the counter." "So," Miss Gable said, trying to sound sharp, "you only saw this boy for a few seconds, in poor lighting, while he was wearing a hood and looking down?" The old man looked confused. I saw him when he looked up. The light was bright, but it was dark outside." Ms. Gable insisted. "Yes? And you were scared?" "A robbery is a traumatic event, isn't it?" Mr. Higgins nodded vigorously, terrified. "I thought he had a gun in his pocket." "So," Ms. Gable concluded, "you were terrified. It was dark, and you only saw him for a few seconds. Can you really be 100% sure that this young man is the one? My client was found 20 minutes later, 5 blocks away. Could it be someone else?" Mr. Higgins hesitated. He looked at Leo, then at the prosecutor, then back at Ms. Gable. I suppose it could be possible. But the eyes. I remember the shape of the eyes. It wasn't the strong denial they needed. It wasn't a no, that's not him. It was a maybe. And in a courtroom, A maybe is almost as good as a yes for the prosecution. Ms. Gable sat down, defeated. She knew she hadn't shaken him. The jury believed the old man. They felt sorry for him. They wanted to help him by catching the bad guy. The prosecutor rested his case, looking very pleased with himself. It was the defense's turn. Ms. Gable stood up and called a character witness, Leo's math teacher. She testified that Leo was a good student and polite. But the prosecutor cross-examined her, asking if Leo had ever been late to class or ever talked back. When she said he had been late a few times, the prosecutor made it sound like he was delinquent. By the time she stepped down, the good student image was tarnished. The judge called for a lunch break. This was the moment Leo had been dreading. The bailiff led him out of the courtroom and down a long hallway to a small, windowless holding room. Ms. Gable followed, carrying her heavy briefcase. The metal door slammed shut with a loud clang, locking them in. Ms. Gable didn't sit down. She paced the small room, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. She looked more stressed than she had in the morning. She turned to Leo, her expression grim. "Leo," she said, her voice low and serious. "We need to talk. We are in trouble." Leo's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "The teacher said I was good. She said you were late," Ms. Gable snapped, rubbing her temples again. "And the clerk. He identified you. The jury trusts him. He looks like a victim, and you look like the defendant. It's not about truth right now. It's about how things look. So what do we do?" Leo asked, his voice shaking. "I didn't do it." "I know," she said, softening her tone slightly. "But the judge is watching. She is a tough-on-crime judge. She sees a minor robbery, but she also sees a defendant who isn't proving his innocence. The way things are going, I don't think we are going to win a not guilty verdict." Leo felt like he might throw up. "But I didn't do it. If I say guilty, they'll send me away. I'll lose my scholarship. I'll have a record." Ms. Gable sighed and leaned against the cold wall. "I'm trying to save your future here. The prosecution might offer a deal. If you plead no contest or guilty to a lesser charge, like trespassing or disorderly conduct, you might get probation. You won't go to jail. But if we go to the jury and they find you guilty of robbery, you could be in a detention center until you're 18. Leo stared at her. "You want me to lie? You want me to say I did something I didn't do?" "It's not about lying," she said, looking away. "It's about strategy. It's about risk management. Sometimes you have to lose a small battle to win the war." Leo felt a spark of anger deep inside him. It was small, but it was hot. He looked at the lawyer, the woman who was supposed to be on his side. She was telling him to give up. She was telling him that the truth didn't matter as much as the risk. She was telling him to become a criminal on paper just to keep himself safe. He thought about his mother crying in the courtroom. He thought about the store clerk looking at him with fear. He thought about the kids at school who would look at him differently if he took the deal. If he admitted to it, even if it was just a deal, he would always be the boy who robbed the store. "I can't do that," Leo said quietly. Ms. Gable looked at him sharply. "Leo, listen to me. This is not a game. You are looking at serious time. You are 16. You don't understand how the system works." "I understand that I didn't do it," Leo said, his voice getting a little stronger. "And if I say I did, my mother will look at me differently. I'll look at myself differently." Gable threw her hands up in frustration. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. We go back in after lunch and I will try to poke holes in the timeline. But honestly, the judge is ready to wrap this up. She is tired. If I were you, I would prepare for a sentencing hearing, not an acquittal." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a sandwich, taking a bite without offering Leo any food. She sat down on the bench, closing her eyes. Signaling that the conversation was over, Leo sat on the floor, leaning his back against the cold concrete wall. He pulled his knees up to his chest. He felt incredibly alone. The anger was still there, burning in his stomach. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair that an old man made a mistake and it was going to ruin Leo's life. It wasn't fair that his lawyer was ready to throw in the towel. He put his hand in his pocket again. His fingers brushed against the crumpled piece of paper. He pulled it out slightly, just enough to see the red A+ written at the top in thick marker. It was his English essay. He'd worked on it for a week. He remembered showing it to his teacher, Mr. Vance. Before class ended, Mr. Vance had smiled and said, "You've got a real gift for storytelling, Leo. Keep it up." Leo stared at the paper. He looked at the date. It was dated the day before. But then he remembered he had turned in a second draft on the morning of the robbery. He had rushed to school early to drop it off before his first class because he wanted the extra credit points to raise his grade. His mind started racing, connecting dots that he hadn't noticed before. He had gone to school early. He had put the essay in the box. The robbery happened at 4:30 p.m. The school had cameras. The teacher would remember. The essay proved he was there, not just near the school, but inside the building, handing in work. He looked at Ms. Gable, who was dozing on the bench. He hadn't told her about the second draft. He hadn't told her he went to school early that day because she never asked him for a detailed timeline of his morning. She just asked where he was after school. He assumed the police checked the school, but maybe they didn't. Maybe they just found him on the street and stopped looking. Leo held the paper tight. Fear began to mix with a strange sensation. It was clarity. He looked around the small room. He was just a kid, but he wasn't helpless. He had the proof in his hand. He just had to figure out how to use it. Keys jingled outside the door, signaling that lunch was over. It was time to go back into the arena. Leo stood up, smoothed his wrinkled shirt, and took a deep breath. He wasn't going to take the deal. He wasn't going to let them win. He was going to speak. Asterisk, the sound of the metal lock turning echoed in the small room, signaling the end of the break. The heavy door swung open, and a stern-looking bailiff stepped aside. Gesturing for them to move, Ms. Gable gathered her files, her face still etched with that tired, defeated look that made Leo's stomach churn.
Here.
She didn't look at him as she walked out into the hallway, her heels clicking a fast, nervous rhythm on the floor. Leo took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of his shirt. His fingers brushed against the lump of the crumpled paper in his pocket. Felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. Heavy and significant, walking back into the courtroom was like walking underwater. The sounds were muffled, and everything moved in slow motion. The audience was settling back into their seats, whispering among themselves. Leo's mother looked up as he entered. Her eyes were redrimmed, and she forced a weak, trembling smile. Leo tried to smile back, but he could feel the muscles in his face twitching. Felt like he was carrying a secret bomb, one that could blow the whole roof off this place. Or one that could blow up in his face. He sat down at the wooden table. The chair was hard and unforgiving. In front of him, the polished wood reflected the fluorescent lights, making him squint. Miss Gable sat next to him, shuffling papers again. She leaned in close, her voice a harsh whisper. "Remember what we talked about?" she said, her eyes scanning the jury box instead of looking at him. "If the judge starts talking about sentencing, we move for the deal. Don't try to be a hero, just let me do the talking." Leo nodded, but he wasn't really listening. His eyes were fixed on the judge's bench. The judge had returned and was looking through her own stack of documents. She looked annoyed, like she had better places to be. This was the reality of the court system. To the people in charge, this was just another Tuesday, just another file to clear. But to Leo, it was his entire life. The prosecutor stood up. He didn't look tired at all. He looked energized, like a predator that had scented blood. He buttoned his jacket and walked to the center of the room.
Your Honor?
The prosecutor said smoothly. The defense has presented character witnesses, but they haven't presented any actual evidence. The state rests its case on the strong identification made by Mr. Higgins and the circumstances of the defendant's arrest. He turned to the jury, spreading his hands wide. "Ladies and gentlemen, think about it." An old man, terrified for his life. "A boy caught blocks away with no good story. Are we supposed to believe this is just a coincidence?" Ms. Gable stood up abruptly. Objection. Argumentative. The judge waved her hand dismissively. Sustained, but move on. The prosecutor smiled a tight smile and sat down. It was Ms. Gable's turn. She stood up, but she didn't look confident. She looked like she was going through the motions. She walked to the jury box, but she kept glancing back at the judge, as if she was afraid of making a mistake. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice lacking the punch of the prosecutor's. The state has asked you to believe in coincidences. They've asked you to believe that my client is guilty because he was walking home. But is that enough? Beyond a reasonable doubt? She paced a little. My client is a student, has no prior record of violence. The identification by Mr. Higgins was made in poor lighting. Can you truly say in your hearts that you are sure? Is it possible, just possible, that they grabbed the wrong kid? It was weak. Leo could feel it. He watched the jurors. A few of them were looking at their watches. One was doodling on a notepad. They weren't buying it, weren't feeling the doubt she was trying to sell. She sounded like a lawyer reading a script, not a woman fighting for a boy's freedom. She finished her statement quickly and sat down, looking relieved it was over. The judge looked up. The silence in the room grew heavy. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at her calendar. Then she looked at Miss Gable. Counsel, the judge said, her voice sharp.
Ow!
Given the lack of concrete alibi evidence from the defense, and the positive identification by the victim, I am inclined to send this directly to the jury for deliberation. Unless you have something else? This was it, the moment Ms. Gable had warned him about. She stood up slowly. Leo could see her hand shaking as she smoothed her skirt. Your Honor, Ms. Gable said, her voice quiet. In light of the circumstances and the risk to the defendant, the defense would be willing to discuss a resolution, a plea to a lesser misdemeanor charge. The room seemed to hold its breath. The prosecutor looked interested. The judge nodded slowly. She picked up her pen, ready to write down the order that would end Leo's life as he knew it. She was going to accept it. They were going to make a deal right there, over Leo's head. He was going to plead guilty to something he didn't do, just to make the paperwork easier. A sudden, hot flash of anger shot through Leo. It started in his stomach and rose up to his throat like bile. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. He looked at his mother. She was crying silently, covering her mouth with her hand. She thought this was the only way. She thought he was going to take the deal. Ms. Gable turned to him and whispered, Just nod, Leo. It's the best we can do. Nod, so we can go home. But Leo didn't nod. He couldn't move his head. Anger was pushing him, fueling him. He remembered the paper in his pocket. He remembered the red A+ on the top. He remembered the specific time he walked into the classroom. He realized that his lawyer had given up. The judge had given up. The only person left who believed the truth was him. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't ask for permission. He just acted. Leo pushed his chair back, the screech of the metal legs. Against the polished floor was incredibly loud, like a scream in a library. It echoed through the high ceiling. Every head in the room snapped toward him. Ms. Gable's eyes went wide with shock. She reached out to grab his arm to pull him back down, but Leo stood up. The judge froze, her pen hovering over the paper. The bailiff took a step forward, hand on his belt. Order. The judge shouted, banging her gavel. Mr. Gable, control your client. But Leo didn't sit down. He stood straight, his legs shaking a little but his back rigid. He looked directly at the judge. For the first time in 2 days, he looked her in the eye. I have something to say, Leo said. His voice cracked at first, sounding small and scared. He cleared his throat, and the next words came out stronger. I have something to give you. The prosecutor jumped up. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. He has no right to address the court. Be quiet. The judge snapped at the prosecutor. She turned her intense gaze back to Leo. The room was dead silent. No one moved. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Young man, the judge said, her voice dangerous but curious. You are interrupting serious court proceedings. Do you understand that you could be held in contempt? You understand that I could add more time to your sentence right now? Leo swallowed hard. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard it hurt. He was terrified. His palms were sweating. He knew that if this went wrong, he was done for. But he also knew that if he sat down, he was done for anyway. Yes, Your Honor, Leo said, his voice trembling only slightly. I understand, but Ms. Gable was about to make a deal. I can't take that deal, because I didn't do it. Ms. Gable put her head in her hands. Leo, stop, she hissed through her teeth. No, Leo said, louder this time. He looked at the jury, then back at the judge. Everyone keeps talking about coincidences. Keep talking about what I look like. Nobody's talking about where I actually was. He reached into his jacket pocket. The bailiff tensed up, his eyes locked on Leo's hand. The prosecutor watched, narrowing his eyes. Leo moved slowly, making sure everyone could see his hand. He pulled out the crumpled, folded piece of paper. It was messy. It had coffee stains on the corner from where he had thrown his backpack down. It didn't look like legal evidence. It looked like trash. "What is that?" the judge asked, leaning forward. "This," Leo said, holding the paper up as proof. He walked toward the bailiff. It was the longest walk of his life. 5 steps. 1, 2, 3. He felt the eyes of the prosecutor burning into his back. 4, 5. He held the paper out to the bailiff.
"Please,"
Leo said to the bailiff. "Give this to the judge." The bailiff looked at the judge. She nodded, confused but intrigued. The bailiff took the crumpled paper and walked it up to the bench. He handed it to the judge. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. The judge took the paper. She frowned at the wrinkles. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing it out on the wood in front of her. Everyone watched her face. Leo held his breath. He watched her eyes scan the page. She was reading the title. Then she was reading the comments at the top. Then her eyes stopped. She zeroed in on the top right corner of the page. Leo knew what she was looking at. It wasn't just the grade. It was the date stamp the teacher had stamped next to the grade. It wasn't just the date. It was the time, Ms. Gable finally looked up. She saw the paper in the judge's hand. She saw the date. Her eyes widened in realization. The color drained from her face. She looked at Leo, her mouth opened slightly. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. She had missed it. She had missed the one thing that could save him. The judge didn't say anything for a long time. She just stared at the paper. She picked it up and looked at the back. Then she looked at the front again. Then, very slowly, she lifted her head. She looked past the prosecutor. She looked past the defense table. She looked straight at Leo. The stern mask was slipping. Her eyebrows raised. She looked confused, and then she looked like she was trying very hard not to react. The reaction was subtle, but Leo saw it. The corner of her mouth twitched. She glanced at the prosecutor, whose face was starting to turn pale as he realized the silence wasn't ending. Leo let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 2 days. He didn't know if it was enough yet, but for the first time, the court wasn't just a machine grinding him down. It was a room full of people waiting to hear the truth. Asterisk, the silence stretched out, heavy and thick, like a blanket over the entire room. Every single person was frozen, watching the judge. She held the crumpled piece of paper in her hands, treating it like it was made of gold leaf rather than a messy homework assignment. She adjusted her glasses, moving them down her nose slightly to get a closer look at the red ink scrawled across the top. Her eyes moved back and forth, scanning the lines of text. Leo stood by the defense table. His knees locked to stop them from shaking. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, making his shirt stick to his skin. The prosecutor, who had been so confident just moments ago, was now shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He looked confused. His eyes darting from the judge to the piece of paper and back to Leo. He was trying to figure out what a kid's essay could possibly have to do with a robbery. A trial, Ms. Gable was staring at the paper too. She wasn't a lawyer who missed things often, but she was human, and she had been overwhelmed. Now, seeing the date and the timestamp in the judge's hand, the color was returning to her cheeks. She looked at Leo with wide eyes, a mixture of shock and dawning hope. She realized that her client hadn't just acted out of turn. He had played a card she didn't even know he had. Finally, the judge looked up. She didn't look at the prosecutor or the jury. She looked straight at Leo. Her face was still stern, but the angry tension around her eyes was gone. She held the paper up, just slightly, for the room to see. "Counsel," the judge said, her voice cutting through the quiet air. "Defense counsel, did you know about this document?" Ms. Gable stood up quickly, smoothing her skirt. "No, Your Honor. I was not aware that my client had this specific item in his possession." The judge turned her gaze to the prosecutor. "And the prosecution?" In your discovery, in your request for school records, did you obtain this? The prosecutor looked flustered. He shuffled through his own stack of papers, looking frantic. Your Honor, we requested attendance records for the day in question. The school sent over a digital log. It shows the defendant was marked present. Objection, the prosecutor shouted. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. A homework assignment is not an alibi. Anyone could write a date on a paper. It proves nothing. Sit down, the judge said, her voice low and dangerous. The prosecutor opened his mouth to argue, thought better of it, and sat down slowly. Looking like he had just swallowed a bug, the judge looked back at the paper, reading aloud for the jury to hear. This is an essay titled "The Meaning of Courage." It is written by the defendant. It is graded with an A+, and at the top, there is a specific note from the teacher. She paused, reading the note carefully. The note reads, "Excellent work, Leo. I am glad you came in early to turn this in before the bell. It set the tone for a great day. Mr. Vance." She looked up, locking eyes with the jury. Mr. Vance has dated this note, November 14th, and he has written a time, 7:45 a.m. The courtroom began to hum with noise as people whispered to each other. The judge raised a hand to silence them. The robbery took place at 4:30 p.m., the judge continued. The defense has argued that the defendant was walking home from school. The prosecution has argued that the defendant was lurking in the neighborhood. However, this paper proves the defendant was inside the school building, interacting with the teacher at 7:45 a.m. Leo took a breath. It was working. But he knew it wasn't enough yet. The prosecutor was right. A paper with a date wasn't solid proof. It was just a piece of paper. He needed to explain. Your Honor, Leo said, stepping forward. He didn't wait for permission this time. That's the second draft. I forgot my first draft at home on my desk. My mom was working late the night before, so I couldn't print it. I had to write it out by hand in the morning. Ms. Gable grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back, but Leo shook her off gently. He looked at the judge. I wrote it fast. You can see the ink is smudged because my hands were cold. But Mr. Vance, my English teacher, he collects homework on a clipboard. He checks them off as you turn them in. That paper has his checkmark next to my name. The judge looked at the paper again. She turned it sideways. There, in blue pen, was a small checkmark. She looked at the back of the paper. There was a coffee stain on the bottom corner. This coffee stain, Leo said, pointing a shaking finger at the paper. I got that when I bumped into a teacher in the hallway. It was Mrs. Higgins from the math department. She has a red mug. I spilled a drop of her coffee when I was running to my locker. She yelled at me for being in the halls. Small gasp came from the back of the courtroom. Leo turned his head. Sitting in the last row, looking very uncomfortable, was a woman in a floral dress. It was Mrs. Higgins. She had come to watch the trial, perhaps out of morbid curiosity or because the school had sent a representative. She stood up slowly. Your Honor, Mrs. Higgins said, her voice trembling. I am a math teacher at the high school. I saw the boy that morning. He bumped into me. I scolded him. And was he carrying that paper? The judge asked. Yes, Mrs. Higgins said. It was in his hand. I remember because I was annoyed that he was running with papers. The prosecutor stood up, looking panicked now. Your Honor, this is all hearsay. We can't just take the word of a teacher who remembers a bump in the hallway. Did you report this bump to anyone? The judge asked Mrs. Higgins. No, ma'am, the teacher said. It was just a spill, but I remember him. He apologized. He helped me clean it up. He was polite. The judge looked at the jury. Then she looked at the prosecutor. It seems your timeline has a significant hole. Mr. Prosecutor, if the defendant was at school at 7:45 a.m., and the robbery happened at 4:30 p.m., and we have a teacher placing him in the school building, but he could have left. The prosecutor yelled, losing his cool. Schools aren't prisons. He could have walked out, put on a hoodie, and robbed the store. Leo shook his head. I didn't. I went to class. I have a study hall 5th period. I was in the library. The librarian, Mrs. Stone, she can tell you. I was checking out a book on World War II. School library log, the judge said, almost to herself. She looked at her bailiff. Is someone from the school present? A librarian? The bailiff went to the door and spoke to someone outside. A moment later, a woman with gray hair and reading glasses around her neck walked in. It was Mrs. Stone, the librarian. She looked nervous to be in court. The judge addressed her. Ma'am, do you recall seeing this student on November 14th? Mrs. Stone squinted at Leo. Yes, he comes in every Tuesday during 5th period. He likes history books. And can you verify this? She held up a clipboard she had been carrying. I actually keep a log of who checks out what for inventory. We had a computer crash, so I wrote it down that day. She looked at her paper. Leo checked out the rise and fall of the Third Reich, atoned 15 p.m. The judge took the clipboard. She compared the handwriting. She looked at the time. 1:15 p.m. Let's see, the judge said, her voice firm. The robbery happened at 4:30 p.m. The store is 20 minutes away from the school. The suspect was seen fleeing at 4:30. If this boy was checking out a book at 1:15 p.m., and the school doesn't let out until 3 p.m.? She looked at the prosecutor. Are you telling me this boy walked out of school at 3 p.m.? Walked 20 minutes to the store, loitered in the cold and rain for over an hour, and then decided to rob a store looking exactly the same as he did when he left school? The prosecutor was sweating now. He had no answer. He looked at his shoes. The witness identification. He mumbled weakly. The witness identified a boy in a hoodie. The judge corrected him. This boy was wearing a school jacket. And we have placed him in the school building at 7:45 a.m. and in the library at 1:15 p.m. and we have a teacher who spilled coffee on his homework. She turned to the jury. The evidence provided by the state was circumstantial. The evidence provided by the defendant just now is concrete and verifiable. She looked back at Ms. Gable. Counsel. Move to dismiss. Ms. Gable stood up, her voice ringing out clear and strong for the first time. Your Honor, the defense moves for a dismissal of all charges due to lack of evidence and proven alibi. The judge paused. She looked at Leo one last time. She saw the scared kid, the crumpled paper, and the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. Granted, the judge said, striking her gavel on the wood block. The sound was final and sharp. The defendant is released immediately. All charges are dropped. The reaction wasn't a cheer. It was a collective release of breath. Leo's mother collapsed into her seat, sobbing into her hands. But this time, they were tears of joy. Ms. Gable put her hand on Leo's shoulder and squeezed it hard. The prosecutor looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, but the judge wasn't done. She picked up the essay, walked down from her high bench, and walked over to the defense table. The bailiff looked startled, but didn't stop her. She handed the paper back to Leo. Mr. Vance is right, the judge said, a small, rare smile touching her lips. You do have a gift for storytelling. And it seems you have a better memory for details than anyone else in this room. Don't lose that. She turned and walked back to her chambers, her robe swishing. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Leo standing in the middle of the room, free. He looked at the essay with the coffee stain and the red A+. He looked at his mother, who was running toward him. He smiled, a real smile, for the first time in days. The truth had set him free. But it was his own courage that had unlocked the door. Asterisk. The sound of the gavel striking the wooden block seemed to hang in the air, echoing off the high ceilings like the ringing of a bell. For a split second, nobody moved. It was as if the entire room was frozen in a block of ice, waiting to see if this was actually real. The prosecutor stood with his mouth slightly open, his face turning a shade of red that made him look like a tomato about to burst. He looked at the jury, then at the judge, and then down at his papers, shuffling them aimlessly. Pretending to look for something that wasn't there. He knew it was over. He had bet everything on a scared old man's memory and a clever speech. But he had lost to a coffee stain and a homework assignment. Then, the ice broke. It started with a sound from the back of the room, a sharp, high-pitched intake of breath followed by a sob. It was Leo's mother. She didn't just cry. She seemed to collapse in on herself as the weight of the last few days lifted off her shoulders. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. The man sitting next to her, a stranger she had met in the hallway, reached over and patted her back gently, but Leo couldn't look at her yet. He was still staring at the judge's empty chair. He felt like he was floating, like his feet weren't actually touching the floor. The buzzing in his ears had stopped, replaced by a rushing sound like ocean waves. He looked down at his hands. They were still trembling slightly, but he managed to unclench his fists. He looked at the defense table. Ms. Gable was leaning back in her chair, her eyes closed, letting out a long, slow exhale. She looked 10 years younger than she had 10 minutes ago. She opened her eyes and looked at Leo, a genuine smile spreading across her face. It wasn't the fake, polite smile lawyers usually give. It was a smile of relief and pride. She reached across the table and squeezed his forearm. "You did it, kid," she whispered. "I was ready to fold, but you saved yourself. Never forget that." Leo felt a lump form in his throat, but this time it wasn't from fear. He nodded, unable to speak. He looked down at the essay on the table. It was still wrinkled and messy, the coffee stain looking like a dark brown map on the paper. It had been sitting in his pocket, ignored and forgotten, yet it had been the most powerful weapon in the room. Suddenly, the bailiff was at his side. He wasn't rough this time. He unlocked the handcuff that had been attached to Leo's wrist and the table. The metal clicked open, and the heavy band fell away. Leo rubbed his wrist, feeling the skin where it had been chafed. He felt lighter, like he had taken off a heavy backpack he had been carrying for miles. He stood up. As he did, the rest of the room seemed to wake up. The jurors stood up too, gathering their things. A few of them looked at Leo. Some smiled shyly, nodding at him as if to say, "Good job." Others looked embarrassed, avoiding his eyes, perhaps feeling guilty that they had been ready to send him away just an hour ago. One juror, an older lady with silver hair, gave him a thumbs up. Leo saw her, and for the first time in days his lips curled into a small, genuine smile. The prosecutor was busy shoving his files into his briefcase. He slammed the lid shut with a little too much force. He didn't look at Leo. He didn't look at anyone. He just grabbed his coat and marched toward the side door, his head down, defeated. He left the room without a word, leaving behind his aura of confidence and arrogance. Leo turned toward the gallery. He saw his mother standing up now, clutching her purse to her chest. Her eyes were red and puffy, her makeup streaked, but to Leo, she had never looked more beautiful. He walked toward the wooden gate that separated the trial area from the audience. The bailiff unlatched it for him and pushed it open. As soon as he stepped through, his mother rushed forward. She didn't say anything. She just wrapped her arms around him and pulled him into a hug so tight he could barely breathe. She was sobbing into his shoulder, her tears soaking through the stiff white fabric of his shirt. "I knew it," she kept repeating over and over, her voice muffled against his chest. "I knew you didn't do it. I knew it." Leo wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on top of her head. He closed his eyes and just held her. He could smell her perfume, the same scent she had worn since he was a little boy. It smelled like safety and home. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered. "It's over. It's really over." He stood there for a long time while the room cleared out around them. The court reporter packed up her machine. The cleaning crew waited outside the door, and Ms. Gable gathered her belongings in the background. Eventually, his mother pulled away, wiping her eyes with a crumpled tissue. She laughed, a shaky, wet laugh. "Look at us," she said. "We're a mess," Leo smiled. "We're okay, though. That's what matters." As they turned to leave, a deep voice spoke from the front of the room. "Young man." Leo turned around. It was Mr. Higgins, the store clerk. He was standing by the witness stand, holding onto his cane. He looked older and more tired than ever, but there was a softness in his eyes now. The fear was gone. Leo walked over to him, his mother staying close by his side. He wasn't sure what the old man was going to say. I wanted to say I'm sorry," Mr. Higgins said, his voice raspy. "I really thought it was you. The police said they found the guy, and I saw you, and I was so scared. I just wanted to be safe. I didn't mean to ruin your life." Leo looked at the old man. He saw the guilt written all over his face. Leo realized that Mr. Higgins was a victim to not just of a robbery, but of his own fear and the pressure from the police to pick someone, anyone. "It's okay, sir," Leo said, and he meant it. "You were scared. I was scared too. We were just caught in a bad situation." Mr. Higgins reached out a trembling hand. Leo took it and shook it. It felt dry and paper-like. "You're a good boy," Mr. Higgins said. "You go on and do great things. Don't let this sour you." "I won't," Leo promised. They said their goodbyes and walked out of the courtroom. The hallway outside was bright and busy, full of people talking on phones and rushing to other courtrooms. The air smelled different out here, less stale, more like the outside world. As they walked toward the exit, Ms. Gable caught up with them. "You're free to go," she told them. "The record will be expunged eventually. It's like this never happened. You can go back to school on Monday." "Monday," Leo repeated. It felt strange to think about school, about math tests and lunch periods. It felt like a lifetime ago. They walked out of the courthouse and into the afternoon sun. The sky was a brilliant blue with fluffy white clouds drifting by. It was a beautiful day. Leo took a deep breath, filling his lungs with fresh air. It tasted sweet. He looked at the busy street. Cars were driving by, people were walking dogs, and the world was just spinning along like it always did. It was amazing to think that while he was fighting for his life inside that gray room, the world outside had just kept going. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the essay. He looked at the A+ grade one more time. He thought about what the judge had said and what Mr. Vance had written. "You have a gift." Leo folded the paper carefully and put it back into his pocket, but this time he didn't hide it deep inside. He kept it in a safe place where he could reach it easily. "You hungry?" his mother asked, wiping the last of the tears from her face. She tried to smile, but her lip was still trembling. "Starving," Leo said. "Can we get burgers?" "From that place you like." His mother let out a real laugh. "We can get whatever you want. You can have the whole menu if you want." Leo laughed too. It felt good to laugh. He put his arm around his mother's shoulders, and they walked down the steps together. He didn't look back at the courthouse. He didn't need to. He wasn't the scared kid in the oversized suit anymore. He was Leo, the guy who told the truth when it mattered most. He looked up at the sky, feeling the sun on his face, and for the first time in a long time, the future looked bright. He walked a little taller, ready for whatever came next, knowing that as long as he held on to the truth, he would be just fine.